Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So, if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times, so stick around. So, if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 39, in which Corianton, Alma's third son that he's writing a letter to, gets a really solid talking to. Because when he went among the Zoramites on that trip that Alma took him on with his brother Shiblon, he ran away with a girl. Or at least he ran away chasing a girl. It seems implied that he didn't get the girl, which is kind of hilarious. But yeah, so he made some bad decisions. He kind of abandoned the ministry that he was entrusted to. Anyways, he made great decisions. And so this chapter that we're going to read today is a continuation of the letter that Alma is giving to his son. And so, yeah, I think without further ado, let's read Alma chapter 40. Now, my son, here is somewhat more I would say unto thee, for I perceive that thy mind is worried concerning the resurrection of the dead. Behold, I say unto you that there is no resurrection, or, I would say, in other words, that this mortal does not put on immortality, this corruption does not put on incorruption, until after the coming of Christ. Behold, he bringeth to pass the resurrection of the dead, but behold, my son, the resurrection is not yet. Now I unfold unto you a mystery, nevertheless, there are many mysteries which are kept, that no one knoweth them save God himself. But I show unto you one thing, which I have inquired diligently of God that I might know, that is concerning the resurrection. Behold, there is a time appointed that all shall come forth from the dead. Now when this time cometh no one knows, but God knoweth the time which is appointed. What's more interesting about this section so far is that it's talking about the resurrection. And it's interesting because in verse 2, it starts with, there is no resurrection. And you're like, wait, no, wait, there is a resurrection. Like, we believe there is a resurrection. And then it takes the whole verse. The very end of the verse, he says, until after the coming of Christ. So for that whole verse, you're reading it, you're like, wait, what? There's no resurrection? What are you talking about? And then he clarifies at the very end, until after the coming of Christ. So when Christ comes, the first time, because that hasn't happened yet for these people, the resurrection will get started. Like, Christ will be the first one raised from the dead, whose mortality put on immortality, and then he opened the gates for everyone else. And also I love how in verse 3, he's talking to his son Corianton, he's like, hey, I know you're worried about this. I know that this is something that you think about, and I'm going to explain to you a mystery, which he says at the end of verse 3, I have inquired diligently of God that I might know. Like, Alma worked for this knowledge that he's just giving his son now. Alma prayed and maybe even fasted and searched the scriptures to figure out this knowledge, to have it revealed to him by God, to make it clear unto him. And he's just giving it to his son Corianton because he's a good dad and he wants to make sure that his son knows the truth. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. Now, whether there shall be one time, or a second time, or a third time, that men shall come forth from the dead, it mattereth not. For God knoweth all these things, and it sufficeth me to know that this is the case, that there is a time appointed that all shall rise from the dead. Now there must needs be a space betwixt the time of death and the time of resurrection. And now I would inquire, what becometh of the souls of men from this time of death to the time appointed for the resurrection? Now, whether there is more than one time appointed for men to rise, it mattereth not. For all do not die at once, and this mattereth not. All is as one day with God, and time only is measured unto men. Therefore there is a time appointed unto men that they shall rise from the dead, and there is a space between the time of death and the resurrection. And now concerning the space of time, what becometh of the souls of men is the thing which I have inquired diligently of the Lord to know, and this is the thing of which I do know. And when the time cometh when all shall rise, then shall they know that God knoweth all the times which are appointed unto man. Now concerning the state of the soul between death and the resurrection, behold, it has been made known unto me by an angel, that the spirits of all men, as soon as they are departed from this mortal body, yea, the spirits of all men, whether they be good or evil, are taken home to that God who gave them life. So Alma starts this chapter by laying the groundwork of talking about the fact that there will be a resurrection after Christ comes. Whether or not there's multiple resurrection events, or like batches of people get resurrected, he doesn't really care. It doesn't really matter. God knows all, that's fine with him, whatever. But then he gets to the real question that he's actually answering. And that is, what happens to the spirits that are dead but haven't yet resurrected? Because for these people in this time period, according to Alma, there has been no resurrection yet. All the dead spirits have not been resurrected yet because Christ has not come yet. And he said in verse 3, there is no resurrection until after Christ comes because he is the first. And so, Corianton likely asked his dad, what happened to them? Did they just have no chance at resurrection? Are they just in the void somewhere? Did they just cease to exist? And then Alma, at the very end of verse 11, he finally says, they are taken home to that God who gave them life. I just like the phrasing, like they're taken home, back to where we were before this life. Isn't that nice? And that's not to say they're going to heaven. It's to say that they're going to a spirit world that is, some sort of living situation that was similar to what we were like before we were born into this earth. You won't have bodies yet, because again, you aren't resurrected yet, and so what that looks like, we don't really know. But it will be home. And then it shall come to pass that the spirits of those who are righteous are received into a state of happiness, which is called paradise, a state of rest, a state of peace, where they shall rest from all their troubles and from all care and sorrow. And then shall it come to pass that the spirits of the wicked, yea, who are evil, for behold, they have no part nor portion of the Spirit of the Lord. For behold, they chose evil works rather than good. Therefore the spirit of the devil did enter into them, and take possession of their house. And these shall be cast out into outer darkness, and there shall be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, this because of their own iniquity, being led captive by the will of the devil. Now this is the state of the souls of the wicked, yea, in darkness, and a state of awful, fearful, looking for the fiery indignation of the wrath of God upon them. Thus they remain in this state, as well as the righteous in paradise, until the time of their resurrection. So nowadays, with the increased kind of modern revelation we've had, we wouldn't use the term outer darkness for what we now call spirit prison. It's clear here that Alma is not talking about true outer darkness, which is a very, very limited space for people that knew God fully and rejected him. It's a very, very difficult place to get to, and that's why very, very few people get there. So he's not talking about what we would call outer darkness today, he's talking about spirit prison. And so after we die, we go into spirit paradise or spirit prison, and that is kind of where we're chilling before we're resurrected. Because again, we don't know how long it's going to take between death and resurrection, but we do know that there is a place that we will go. And that especially matters for these people because Jesus hasn't come yet. And according to Alma, again, there's no resurrection until that happens. And there's a lot of humanity that existed before Jesus Christ came. And so all those people will be resurrected after Christ. And so they're chilling in spirit paradise or spirit prison for a long time. Also, with some modern revelation, we do know that there are basically missionaries in spirit prison that preach to those in spirit prison, which is so cool. Like, God gives us those second chances even after we die. Even if we lived a sucky life and did not listen to any of God's commandments, we can still turn around our lives. We can still change. We can still be taught after we die, which is awesome. Now, there are some that have understood that the state of happiness and the state of misery of the soul before the resurrection was a first resurrection. Yea, I admit it may be termed a resurrection, the raising of the spirit or the soul and their consignation to happiness or misery, according to the words which have been spoken. And behold, again it hath been spoken that there is a first resurrection, a resurrection of all those who have been, or who are, or who shall be, down to the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Now, we do not suppose that this first resurrection, which is spoken of in this manner, can be the resurrection of the souls and their consignation to happiness or misery. Ye cannot suppose that this is what it meaneth. Behold, I say unto you, nay, but it meaneth the reuniting of the soul with the body, of those from the days of Adam down to the resurrection of Christ. Now, whether the souls and the bodies of those of whom has been spoken shall all be reunited at once, the wicked as well as the righteous, I do not say. Let it suffice that I say that they all come forth, or in other words, their resurrection cometh to pass before the resurrection of those who die after the resurrection of Christ. So now we're not only getting into what happens between death and resurrection, but also, what is the first resurrection? And it's interesting because in verse 15 he says, fine, you could say death and being assigned to either spirit paradise or spirit prison is a resurrection of some kind, because I guess your essence doesn't really stay dead. But you don't have a body, and so it doesn't really count as a resurrection. That's kind of an interesting thing that he brings up, where there are kind of two resurrections in the same way that there are two deaths. There is a physical death and a spiritual death, and so I guess you could say there's a spiritual resurrection and a physical resurrection. And what he's referring to when he says resurrection is a physical resurrection, and the act of dying and being sent to spirit prison or spirit paradise, that's just spirit resurrection, because your spirit doesn't die. So anyways, that was an interesting distinction that he made, and I'm pretty sure that I understand him correctly. Now, from verses 16 and onward, he starts talking about the first resurrection, which, to my understanding, is the resurrection of everyone that died before Christ, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a lot of people. That is thousands of years of history, both recorded and unrecorded. That is so many people just chilling out in spirit prison or spirit paradise for who knows how long. And again, we don't know if time works the same in the afterlife, but still, it has been a long time, and these people have been waiting to get their bodies back. They've been waiting for Christ to break the bands of physical death and allow them to reclaim their bodies. And he specifies in verse 18, by the word resurrection, he means the reuniting of the soul with the body. So they get separated when you die, and then when the resurrection happens, you get it back. And he doesn't really specify exactly when that first resurrection happens, which is presumably when Jesus dies and gets resurrected, or at least very soon afterwards, because he says in verse 19, the first resurrection happens before the resurrection of those who die after the resurrection of Christ. So everyone who died before Christ gets resurrected before those who died after, which makes sense, but it's just kind of an interesting thing to specify, because, I mean, is there a pecking order in who gets resurrected first? It doesn't seem like there is, aside from when that person died, at least in terms of the first resurrection. Again, as Alma mentioned before, we don't know if there are just going to be multiple resurrection events, or if you get resurrected immediately, or if the first resurrection is the only one with a name and the rest just kind of happens. We don't know. But the cool thing is, if you go back to verse 5, what Alma says, and I agree with, he says, God knoweth all these things, and it sufficeth me to know that this is the case. He's like, I don't need to know everything. I really don't. But I do care that God knows everything. And since he has it in his capable hands, that's good enough for me. And I think that's a good way to just live life in general. If I don't understand what's going to happen to me after I die, but I know that it's going to be cool, and I know that I'm going to get my body back, that's enough for me. I don't need to know all the gritty details. I don't need to understand exactly what happens if, say, some of my siblings are inactive, or say there are some unfair situations where families are broken apart. I don't need to know these things because I know that God's plan is perfect and that he has it well in hand. And he will do the fair, the just, the merciful thing. And so, a lot of people really struggle with the plan of salvation because it means, oh no, what if my complex family situation isn't taken care of correctly? What if my specific personal situation that's really complex is not taken care of effectively, or justly, or mercifully? How does that work? And the real, genuine answer is, we do not know how things will work out in the eternities, but we do know that they will. And I, for one, have enough trust in God and enough trust in his eternal wisdom and mercy and justness that I think that it will all be okay. I just love that Alma specified, hey, I don't need to know everything about the resurrection. I don't need to know everything about the afterlife, but I know that God's got it. And that is a lovely way to live life. And that honestly gives me a lot of freedom, because my life isn't straightforward, and I'm sure yours isn't either. I'm sure you have questions of how is this going to get dealt with after I die, but it will. Rest assured, it will. God knows all, and he is perfectly just and perfectly merciful, and that is something that we can be sure about. Now, my son, I do not say that their resurrection cometh at the resurrection of Christ, but behold, I give it as my opinion that the souls and the bodies are reunited of the righteous at the resurrection of Christ and his ascension into heaven. But whether it be at his resurrection or after, I do not say. But this much I say, that there is a space between death and the resurrection of the body, and a state of the soul in happiness or in misery, until the time which is appointed of God, that the dead shall come forth and be reunited, both soul and body, and be brought to stand before God, and be judged according to their works. Yea, this bringeth about the restoration of those things of which has been spoken by the mouths of the prophets. The soul shall be restored to the body, and the body to the soul, yea, and every limb and joint shall be restored to its body, yea, even a hair of the head shall not be lost, but all things shall be restored to their proper and perfect frame. And now, my son, this is the restoration of which has been spoken by the mouths of the prophets. And then shall the righteous shine forth in the kingdom of God. But behold, an awful death comes upon the wicked, for they die as to things pertaining to things of righteousness. For they are unclean, and no unclean thing can inherit the kingdom of God. But they are cast out, and consigned to partake of the fruits of their labors or their works, which have been evil, and they drink the dregs of a bitter cup. Dang, wicked people don't even get the whole bitter cup. They get the dregs of the bitter cup. How rude. Oh man. Anyways, what a fascinating chapter. This really gets into our theology of the afterlife, of the resurrection, of spirit paradise and spirit prison. That comes from this chapter, which is freaking awesome. Alma really gets into it, and may I remind you, this is for the sake of his son. This is clearly to answer his son's question about what happens to people after we die. What goes on? Is there a resurrection? Is there an afterlife? I've been told there's a heaven and hell. I don't really understand it. And Alma goes into great detail to explain it to his son and make sure that he understands so that he knows what is going to happen to him. And that is what I love about these chapters, which are the letters that he's sending to his various sons, whether it's Helaman or Shiblon or this chapter, Corianton. It just shows how much Alma cares about his sons, how much he cares about clarifying things for them and easing their mind on certain subjects and teaching them so that they have the truth and the correct knowledge to live their lives with. I just love that small detail, and I feel like it's taken for granted sometimes, so there you go. Anyways, as I mentioned, this is a fascinating chapter that not only gets into resurrection and what happens between death and resurrection, but also maybe when the resurrections happen and what happens to people after the resurrection, etc., etc. Oh my goodness, it's so interesting. So, putting it into basic words, what Alma kind of laid out in this chapter, to my understanding, is that when we die, we get sent either to spirit paradise if we were righteous, or spirit prison if we were less righteous, let's say, maybe wicked. And we know from modern revelation, again not mentioned in this chapter, that there are going to be missionaries sent to spirit prison to teach those people that are there. And then people get resurrected, either in the first resurrection, if you were born and died before Jesus got resurrected, or at some later time, which is less clear specifically when it's going to be, for those that died after Jesus got resurrected. And what resurrection is, it's specifically putting a soul back with its body, and it says specifically in verse 23, all things shall be restored to their proper and perfect frame. So not only are you going to get your body back, but it's going to be perfect. It's going to be unchanged. It even says, not a hair of the head shall be lost. So, pretty sick. And then after you're resurrected, then you are judged and then ultimately put in your final resting place. I guess I shouldn't say resting place, but final living place, I guess, because we have our bodies back and we're alive. So anyways, this is pretty amazing stuff, and I think that's really important for understanding what we believe about the afterlife. Again, there has been further modern revelation, specifically in the D&C, talking about the three kingdoms of glory, etc., but this chapter covers some of the most important stuff, which is resurrection. What is it? When does it happen? What happens before you're resurrected, etc., etc. It's fascinating, and I freaking love it. So the standout verse is going to be verse 5, which I've already kind of mentioned, but it says, now whether there shall be one time, or second time, or a third time, that men shall come forth from the dead, it mattereth not. For God knoweth all these things, and it sufficeth me to know that this is the case, that there is a time appointed that all shall rise from the dead. And so I've already mentioned that my favorite part of this verse is where he says, God knoweth all these things, and it sufficeth me to know that this is the case. Partially what I love about this chapter is that all over the place, Alma says, I don't know, or it doesn't matter. And he doesn't try to fill in every single gap with speculation or stretching the knowledge that he does have. He just says, this part, I don't know. But it doesn't really matter because God's got it. Like, if you believe in a God that is just and merciful, you also need to believe that he has it in hand. Like, he's fine. We are covered. And I just love how all over the chapter he says, this part, it doesn't really matter. Or this part, I just don't know. And that, I think, is a sign of someone who's very honest. He's not trying to make his son think that he's all-knowing. He's not trying to make his son think that he's the perfect theologian and he understands all the mysteries of God. He just says what he knows. He says, hey, I've worked for this knowledge. I've prayed to God to try and understand this better. And this is what I've got. I'm not all the way there. I don't think I'll ever be all the way there. But this is what I have, and I'm going to give it all to you so that you know what is going to happen after you die. Anyways, I just love that small detail, how he's always like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. That is a corner that I cannot see around, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to see around it. But God can, and that is what really matters. That principle of God having a plan that makes perfect sense to him and is perfectly just and perfectly merciful, that is another thing that he's trying to teach his son Corianton. It's good to understand things that we can understand, But we can't understand everything in this life. There are some mysteries of God that we just cannot fathom in this life, and that is okay. That doesn't mean that God isn't real, it just means that he functions outside of our frame of reference sometimes. Anyways, this is such a cool chapter. I really love how deep it gets into the weeds of resurrection and understanding all that stuff. And I also love that Alma is just explaining it all to his own son, to make sure that he gets as good an answer to his question as Alma can provide. So anyways, yeah, that's the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed. This is such a fascinating chapter. Oh my gosh, it's so neat. But yeah, there's just a few links down in the show notes that I want to mention to you. The first one is a let me know you learned link. So if you want to shoot me a message and chat with me, I guess, about anything, then you can do that there, or you can DM me on Instagram. Either way. Secondly, there are a handful of links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon, so if you want to read along for yourself, or just find a chapter or a book or a verse that you really like, then go ahead and click those. Thirdly, there's a quick support the show link, so if you want to shoot me a few dollars and support what I do, I would greatly appreciate that. Fourthly, we are on YouTube, so if you want to go listen to the podcast on that platform, you can go subscribe there. There are also, every once in a while, some trivia on the community page, which you can go find. And finally, we are on Instagram, so if you want to go follow me on Instagram, that is where I'm the most active, I post the most often, and you get the most trivia. So, go follow me there, I will see you there. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.